members of the audience. Wanted to give you a little bit of the run of show for today. We are continuing to move through the information gathering phase of this committee's discussions. And the two topics that we're going to cover today is we're going to hear from the Chief Data Officer's perspectives. As many of you know, the panel and in the audience, the Evidence Act of 2018 is a short version, created Chief Data Officers, and they've been a very active newly emerging group and council in the federal government. So great to hear their perspectives. We're going to hear from some insights from external researchers. So it's now, I was joking that this is now the opportunity to hear from the external researchers to tell us a thing or two to the federal, to us feds. And also we're going to hear a recap of the future state and a North Star feedback. So we're going to talk a little bit to start to try to get a synthesis of what our ultimate goals are and insights that we've gleaned over the past few times. So just as a recap, in case you missed it, we heard from last month, we heard from representatives of the federal statistical system. So thanks for all of them, what they're working on, what they've planned. So thank you to Milda Rivers, Brian Moyer, Barry Johnson. And we also heard from so I have the names here, Christine Heflin, Todd Richardson, Matt Soldner, and Christina Yancey, provide the reflection on the current state and challenges of the federal performance and evaluation officers. So there's two important areas of data focus in the federal government. Thanks everyone for all their work putting together. I thought those all were great presentations, and I have high expectations that these presentations today will meet those high standards as well. So before we go, as always, I have a little housekeeping. And one really good one, we wanted to give you an update on the public outreach. Those are closed now. We received about 200 comments, more than 30 commenters. So thank you very much for that. They came both through the evidence website and the regulations.gov docket websites. And I think those both have closed, and the comments actually are available as of this meeting to the public. So if anyone wants to take, I understand they are on this committee's public website. I'm sure at some point we can share a link to that during this meeting. We plan, to spend some time to go over the public input at our March meeting. And we also, as always, we want to try to digest them and see if the agenda of this meeting pretty quickly should be adjusted to add some topics, to convene a subcommittee, or how much we want to spend during this committee meeting on the public comments, which I would say we should spend a good amount of time digesting those, because that's a very important part of this process. Okay, a couple other housekeeping. Just to reiterate our ground rule on the use of the chat function, that the committee should, they can indicate that whether they have a question in the chat function internally, that will be released, but for the purposes of this meeting, if they could repeat it verbally so the audience can see it. And as always, we'll publish a curated, edited version of the chat function on the website at some point after the meeting. And also, as I mentioned several times before, our friends and colleagues, stakeholders that are listening in, please, you also have a chat function. Please raise your questions and comments at any time. They'll be sent to our brave host, and she'll try to get my attention or someone else's attention who is actually talking. I think we've done pretty well with that, and we will raise them as time allows. We also, as always, even if we can't get to them during the committee meeting, we will pass them along to the presenters in the committee, and to see if we can say something about them in the curated chat, which will be available. And as always, you can also send comments to the email address, evidence@bea.gov. Okay, great. With that out of the way, let's turn to our first briefing and presentations, the insights from the federal chief data officers, which I'm actually have had the good opportunity to be a relatively close participant in as well. So we have three. We have Richard Allen, the CDO of the Environmental Protection Agency, Greg Fertelny, the CDO of the Department of Education, and Ted Kalk, the CDO of the Department of Agriculture, who also happens to be on this committee and is the chair of the Federal CDO Council. So you have literally the most people who have been most involved in this effort in the federal government. And so with that, I will turn it over to those just presenters and to get going. So thanks everyone. Looking forward to it.
Well, good morning, Dom. Thank you for the introduction. Really looking forward to the discussion and just to share a few of the things that the CDO Council has been working on over the past year or so. So we'll maybe go on to the next slide, but good presentations from Greg and Richard, and just looking forward to the discussion. So just wanted to provide a quick overview as a new council in government. The Chief Data Officer Council was established under the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. We, along with the requirement that agencies establish the Chief Data Officer position, agencies have been doing that over the course of this year. We had our first meeting in January of 2020, so just a little over a year ago. And in fact, because all agencies are required to have the CDO position, the CDO Council is actually the largest council in government. And so we've worked together over the last year, both as those individual positions as well as those Chief Evaluation Officers where those positions exist, to define those individual roles and also to look at how we can collaborate on the federal data strategy and best practices to improve our ability to leverage our data as a strategic asset. So looking forward just to sharing some of the work to date. It's been a really great community and great to get to know all the folks that have been in those positions. We'll go to the next slide. So we do have a number of statutory responsibilities that are really well aligned, obviously, with the work of this advisory committee. They're to establish government-wide best practices for the use, protection, dissemination, and generation of data, to promote and encourage data sharing agreements, look at how we can improve the production of evidence, and do consultations with the public and private users of government data on how to improve access to data assets of the federal government. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done to date and what we look to do in the future. We'll go on to the next slide. In addition to those statutory requirements, we have really, again, seen it as a great opportunity for us to work together as a community of learning, where we know that various components of our data community in that larger team, whether that's privacy officials or statistical officials, FOIA community, there's been work that's gone on for many, many years, and we want to be able to leverage that to the best extent. So as a community, we've defined it as really important that we leverage those best practices and continue to build upon them, not to invent them out of whole cloth. So we've been meeting every month with various discussion sessions, talking about what's happening at agencies, kind of lifting up those practices, and then beginning to think about playbooks and how to kind of codify those things in coordination with other councils. And then, of course, we've also been implementing a number of actions, individual actions on the federal data strategy. Its first year as an action plan, things like establishing our data governance boards, assessing our data maturity and infrastructure, assessing the data skills at our agencies. And so we've been working together on a number of efforts to support that as well. Go to the next slide. One thing that we've talked a lot about on the CDO Council is kind of how we define evidence. I think as CDOs, we have some broad opportunities as we partner with our other officials in our agencies to improve access to information. So we really have taken a careful look at the OMB guidance on the various components of evidence and thought about those various use cases for policy analysis, performance measurement, foundational fact-finding, and program evaluation. I think one of the things that I'll talk about in terms of the experience at USDA has been the real energy around things like performance measurement and performance management that have had an impact on our culture, our willingness to share data, and that has, I think, a broader impact on all of these areas. So how do these things fit together when we're working across our community and really kind of trying to transform how we use information as a strategic asset? Next slide. So we talked about the Chief Data Officer role and various ways in which CDOs are working at agencies to leverage data as a strategic asset. At some agencies, they're beginning to leverage central analytics capabilities. I'll talk about that later today. They're looking at ways to create self-service platforms that not only make data but also data products available to consumers. We are performing the data governance activities in some cases for the first time at agencies, and we'll share a little bit about that today. But there's just a whole host of activities that CDOs are engaged in. They're aligned with the federal data strategy, and I think in a lot of cases, individual CDOs are really trying to engage their agencies on what matters to them, so that they can establish themselves in that position and really deliver value. Because I think as part of the position being new, one of our efforts is to really kind of see where we can have an impact and how we can show the value of the position. So we've talked a lot about that on the council as well. Go to the next slide. So this is our council structure. We have an executive committee. Dom is on the executive committee. We also have the federal CIO on the committee, as well as chair and vice chair, which is required to be an agency CDO. We, as largest council, have established representatives both to our CFO Act agencies and to the small agencies, so that we can engage those communities on their various needs. And then we've established a number of working groups. And so this is the structure we've established over, let's say, the past 6 months or 8 months or so. And it's really starting to engage as an operational unit now. I'll go to the next slide. So we've had a number of focus areas. One of the areas that we focused on initially was COVID-19. Agencies had a deep need for better access to information and decision-making tools. So the CDO Council, as its first working group, began to work with HHS to define the questions that agencies had, to identify the gaps, to connect some of the dots in terms of the existing working groups, and to develop data products that could be shared across agencies. Through that working group, we identified a number of challenges, obviously, with our ability to share consistent data products across agencies. And so that's resulted in both a playbook, a lot of learning as the council has tried to do this cohesively, and then also a project to look at the use cases for government-wide decision-making tools and best approaches for implementing something like that. We've also, as I said, focused on the federal data strategy with our discussion sessions. We have established working groups on data skills, where we're working to establish use cases across 10 agencies as part of a playbook this year. And we've also been partnering on the first federal-wide data science hiring, which has, I think, gotten a lot of attention, and really excited about building upon those efforts going forward. We've established a data sharing working group, which Greg will talk about in more detail, where we're looking at the various use cases about when agencies share data, what the challenges and opportunities are, and what the best practices are. We're taking that holistic view and partnering with our other federal councils on that. And then also a working group on data inventories. This year, we're really also focused on engaging with the public, and so we're looking at stakeholders and beginning to shape up some of our public engagement activities for this year. So really excited about the things that are underway and the ways that it's going to support both our inter council collaboration as well as individual agency CDOs and the work that they're doing to implement the federal data strategy. Go to the next slide. So I think this is just some other summary of the work that we have going on. One of the key things I think that we've focused on over the last couple of months is having had the opportunity over the last year to sort of develop individual identities and kind of engage in our agency activities for the first time in this role. We've also been partnering with our other councils, evidence councils, the Chief Evaluation Officer Council, and the ICSP in particular, but also with the FOIA officers and privacy and the Federal Geospatial Data Committee to collaborate, right? To understand what activities are ongoing, whether that's with re-identification risk, who's leading, who can participate, who can collaborate, so that we have an aligned approach there. And we think that collaborative approach is going to help us to leverage our resources most effectively. So we've been working really hard on developing a framework for collaboration across those other councils. I talked about the government-wide dashboard project and the data skills project. We're also working on other analytics projects, looking at how to automate some of the public activity around public comments analysis, and just really excited again to continue the work and build upon what's happened over the last 6 months or so. I'll just say it's been a pleasure to work with the CDOs at those agencies, and just look forward to the continued opportunity here. So wanted to give an example, as we talked about the various types of evidence, of some of the things that have been at USDA. I think one of the activities that we found particularly transformational has been a focus on increasing our own internal leadership's access to the information they have to make decisions. So I wanted to talk about that kind of roadmap that we've been on over the past couple of years to stand up enterprise analytics capabilities, which is really leading into our broader data governance efforts and supporting really the Evidence Act and our larger opportunities with the public. So I think we'll go to the next slide. And one more, please. So we've had a couple areas of focus over the last couple of years, really moving from a very siloed environment across 19 agencies at USDA to making information available at the click of a button for leadership at our department. We've done this in two fronts. One is been working with our leadership to ask them what questions they have, really focused on those business needs, and doing a rapid iteration on dashboard development, which has led to real interest in the possibilities for what questions could be answered. I think one of the key aspects of the activity has been really moving people from skepticism and suspicion to hope and optimism about the kinds of questions that can be answered. And I think the dashboard development activity and the iterative nature of it really helped people to see what was possible. They would ask the questions. Sometimes it would be about lifting them up, about thinking about what data they thought they had access to, but really focusing on what questions they had, and then applying the right analytics capabilities and techniques to answer those questions, bringing them back to them a month later and having them let us know how well those questions had been answered, and getting them really excited about improving those by engaging them on it. Often what we find is that they would ask a question, we would bring back the best available data and answer to that question, and they would say, having seen it visualized, well, you answered my question, yes or no, but I think more importantly, now I have a better question. And so that iterative process of doing that on a weekly basis across the entire department led into a deep demand for data, which helped to break down the data silos that we had, and led into an enterprise analytics platform, if we go into the next slide, that is really kind of transforming how people are accessing information at the department. So go to, perfect, thank you. So over the last couple of years, we've developed about 500 dashboards. We have increased our number of users to over 10,000. We have really eliminated a lot of manual reports by developing dashboards on things like HR that may have been developed across 19 agencies. And as part of that process, that's really helped us to get to an enterprise platform where we're integrating data from all of our 19 agencies, beginning to blend data across our agencies where questions require us to look beyond the boundaries of an individual agency, and really just changing the culture around how we use and share information. So, a couple of examples that I could highlight is, forest supervisors having a 360-degree view into all of the key metrics that they manage in their individual forests, scientists and public health officials in their food safety office having key metrics and a 360-degree view into all the establishments that they manage, and really doing this in a consistent approach. We'll go to maybe the next slide here. So we did this really in two parts. The first thing we did was we started on all the functions that were common to everybody: human resources, IT, property and fleet, budget and finance. And again, by engaging them in questions, we were able to hit leaders across all of our agencies in a single shot with this idea of a unified approach. And I think through that process initially over the first year, what really happened was that agency leaders realized that we might have the data to answer their questions, but it might not be data that they owned or managed. And we developed this sort of codependency and this culture of interdependency that helped us to see that getting to the answers that we were seeking really required us to work in a collaborative way. So this first year gave us our enterprise HR dashboards, helped us to really look at our managing our property and fleet across 19 agencies. But I think more importantly, really focused on the interdependencies of the agencies and the offices. Next slide. So after that, we moved into our mission areas, and we worked through 12-week cycles to bring them kind of the insights that I was just talking about for forest supervisors, for scientists. And the iterative process, I think, led to a lot of demand, right? So there was a lot of excitement about the questions that were answered, but these were temporary deployments, modernization efforts. And it really led to people asking questions about, well, how could we do more? How could we improve? How can we get the capacity within our agencies to do this for the long term? So I think at that point, we were really in a place where the federal data strategy was being published. We had been doing this for a couple of years, and we were required and actually had a good opportunity to establish a governance board because we had an enterprise platform. We had a lot of needs and a lot of questions about how we can move forward. And so that really is where we did our data maturity assessment. There was a lot deeper interest in the sort of larger iceberg of data management that had been started and made visible by even some of the data quality issues that we made people aware of through the dashboarding project. And that led into our broader strategy. So I think one of the lessons learned for me is the opportunity to deliver value as a way of making people aware of the larger data functions that support them and the opportunities there. So go on to the next slide. That's really led into this broader data strategy. Through the assessment process, we did a number of things. We realized that we needed data officers in each of our mission areas. We have each of our agencies represent a very large portfolio. So rural development is like the 11th largest lender in the country, where they provide loans and grants for housing, for community facilities like hospitals in rural America, broadband. And so we established assistant chief data officers in each of those mission areas to both participate in our governance board so we could have an enterprise approach and really to drive forward the work that had been started with the dashboarding efforts, building upon a centralized analytics team that would answer cross-mission area questions, but also enabling the program areas with a common approach. I think the combination of the dashboarding work and then a work to standardize on tools has been really valuable. We wouldn't be able to share data products if we weren't relying on a common data visualization product and we didn't have a common platform. So bringing all those things together was really valuable, and having the assistant chief data officers in the mission areas looking at those requirements, but then coordinating on an enterprise data governance board has been really valuable. We also work with them to develop our skills assessment. We've finished that assessment, and we're now working on a gap analysis, both looking at the common areas of need across the department that we can focus on together, as well as things that are more tailored and individualized for agencies and their needs. We have, through our assessment process, we recognized again the benefits of having a common platform, and so we are going to be working over the next few years to implement a modernization strategy to get to a standardized approach to how we manage and share information across the department through our enterprise analytics platform. And just one example of that is how it's supporting our open data efforts. We, in the past, may have stood up individual platforms and solutions, even in individual program areas, standing up platforms for creating products that the public could access. We now have a common open data platform that we're building upon to not only make the data available, but also to make automated dashboards available for the public to be able to access information in a lot more user-friendly way. So go on to the next slide. I talked about the assistant chief data officer, and so I think we've gone into the areas of focus that they have, where they're focused on dashboard adoption, development, coordination, and their own data strategies and their own governance boards that are coordinating with the department. So really excited about the way that role has developed over the last year since that's been in place, and just one model that we're using to kind of coordinate efforts across a complex department. Next slide. Yeah, I talked about the workforce assessment, so I think we can probably move on past this slide. And then just focus on one other area that we've worked on across the department, both with the assistant chief data officers and their staffs, but also just the larger communities of interest and the analysts. We've establish a data visualization community of practice where we're sharing the success stories and bring those communities together to really show best practices, whether that's how you're creating the products, the templates that we use to make it easier for folks to find the information, and really just to build that community. We've also established an advanced analytics community of practice that meets every other month, again, to highlight the work, to bring attention to it. We've also highlighted some of the efforts through dashboarding competitions across the department. We're really just excited about the community that's been built around this. And one more slide. And then finally, just as a recap of the results of our assessment, where we're working to build upon the work that we've done to establish a common platform. We've done some assessment work. We're now doing road mapping activities with each of our mission areas. We have a very large contingent of people across our 8 mission areas who are now helping to lead evaluation of alternatives and, getting excited, I think, about the larger opportunities we have as a department. We've stood up a data science workbench pilot with 7 agencies that is now supporting those analysts getting access to the data in a common platform. And really, I think that's going to be the next iteration of the transformation. It's not just the dashboards, but now enabling analysts across the department to have access to the data they need, but also to collaborate across agency lines for the first time. So, again, I'll leave that as our introduction. I think the summary takeaway is that focusing on the individual agency needs and the leadership needs on things like performance management is leading into our efforts to catalog our data, to make it open and available to the public, and to support the larger evidence building activities. And so I think it's important for agencies to think about how this might build into supporting something like a federal data service. Certainly that's something that we're thinking about is getting our own internal act together. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Greg, who's going to talk about data sharing. Look forward to the questions.
Good morning, folks. Can I get a thumbs up if folks can hear me? Awesome. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Greg Fratelli. I'm the Department of Education's Chief Data Officer. A little bit about my background. I've been in this role for a few years. Prior to that, I served as the department's director for the Policy and Program Study Service, which was an internal think tank that did policy analysis. And then before that, I worked for about 7 years at the Office of Federal Student Aid, which does Pell Grants, student loans. A lot of folks are aware of that organization. It's an office within the Department of Education, and most recently I served as their Director of Statistical Research and Modeling. So pretty long and background in terms of the work that I've done at the Department of Education. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what I want to talk to you here, just to provide a little bit of a roadmap. I want to give an overview of my organization and the perspective that we have. I'm going to talk about a few products that we have that have benefited from data sharing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some lessons learned and some data sharing challenges that we've identified, but also leave folks with some within agency and across agency solutions that I think will help us kind of improve our ability to share data across boundaries. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the department and really my perspective. So the department is largely a grant-making agency. We make quite a few grants, very sizable grants to states as well as others. We have an annual budget of about $73 billion and total full-time employees of about 4,000. So this makes us one of the largest federal agencies in terms of budget, but also one of the smallest cabinet agencies in terms of staff. So it's to say it's a lot to manage with very few resources. My office is relatively new. We've been around for about a year and a half. We're responsible for managing and improving the department's ability to leverage data as a strategic asset. We have 2 different divisions. One's an analytics division and one is a governance division. The analytics division does a lot of quick turn analyses and supports developing an analytical infrastructure to do those analyses. And our governance division sets and enforces data governance policies, but also creates public-facing products that largely have benefited from data sharing efforts. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk you through 2 examples. One is the college scorecard, which folks may be familiar with. I know a couple of folks on the call have actually been involved in its development, but also a relatively new product, the Education Stabilization Fund Public Transparency Portal. So I'll get into those in just a moment. Next slide. So the college scorecard. It's unclear. I believe you all may be able to click on the link if you have access to the slides, but that should be a hyperlink at some point if you want to visit it. But the college scorecard is a tool designed to help make students make informed decisions about their educational options. And these, a lot of the benefit from this is educational outcomes. So the underlying data file for this is actually it has an accessible API for others to tap, and it contains, I want to say, about 1,500 columns of data that have been the result of a lot of successful data sharing efforts. So as an example, while we report post-college earnings in the aggregate, those figures are actually based upon a data sharing agreement between the Department of Education and the Department of Treasury. And what we really did there was map individual level data from things like the FAFSA and from the NSLDS, from our federal student aid systems, to earnings information. And Barry Johnson on our call has been involved in this effort, has been very supportive of it. He has access to the earnings information over at Statistics of Income. Next slide, please. So the college scorecard has been around for a while, but this portal is relatively new. It launched in November. It's our Education Stabilization Fund Public Transparency Portal, and it provides transparency and accountability to the $30 plus billion with a B that were provided through the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act. Along with those funds comes quite a bit of data. So this product actually does not use individual level data, but has actually leveraged the existing systems and resources to merge financial reporting from our own finance office, sub-award reporting that comes through Treasury's FAFATA and Data Act reporting, as well as statistical studies from the National Center for Education Statistics. Soon, it will also report on annual performance reporting that our grantees just submitted, I want to say a few weeks ago. But that's obviously got to wait until we vet the data for quality, make some adjustments, and it'll be displayed here. Next slide, please. So why did I talk about these products? So these initiatives were challenging to achieve. There were a lot of lessons learned. The challenges that exist, I think, in sharing data across agencies are also challenges that exist in sharing data across boundaries within a particular agency. We've talked in this committee about the importance of interoperability. Even within the Department of Education, we have a number of ways in which we identify a post-secondary institution. We have federal school codes, we have OPEIDs, we have DUNS numbers. They all serve their own individual purpose, but it also creates some challenges in integrating the data beyond those purposes. So a lot of these things we'll need to dig into. Next slide, please. So it's my perspective that I think a significant amount of attention has already been placed on technological solutions. I don't think a day goes by without a vendor reaching out to me or my staff, letting us know that they have a data management platform that will solve all of our challenges. I don't believe that technology is really the reason keeping us from using more data strategically or sharing it across organizational boundaries. I think those technologies and platforms exist to make data sharing secure, but I think they overlook some key critical things that happen in practice. So the instances that I've seen testing these solutions often assume data sits in an easily accessible flat file. For those of you in complex organizations, that's rarely the case. The more valuable data tends to be more granular, it tends to be more complex, and really from an operational and architectural perspective, it's intentionally designed to not be a simple flat file. Until those things can be addressed simultaneously, we're still really testing things in theory and not really in practice. I think two fundamental challenges that really need to be worked out, in addition to the technology piece that others are working on, are the people and the processes associated with those data. If understanding data quality means you need to talk to Mike in Office X, if business rules have not really been documented, or if data is being collected via paper or PDF, and yes, it really happens, being collected via email, major data sharing initiatives will quickly become challenging, burdensome, and I think in the statutory language, impracticable. So I think these are things that we'll really need to dig into. Next slide, please. So what do we do? I think there's some intra-agency work and some inter-agency work. Both really should be seen as necessary prerequisites for data sharing. For individual agencies, they must really take steps to ensure that their data management practices lend itself to secure sharing. And then across agencies, government as a whole really needs to take proactive steps to reduce costs and increase the perceived value of secure data sharing. Next slide. So intra-agency efforts. So as I mentioned before, there's a certain number of things that individual level agencies must be engaged in as a prerequisite to participate in data sharing. They need to be taking proactive steps to ensure that basically their data management practices lend itself to secure sharing. So this is where the things like data quality, metadata management, master data management, common standards, and data management practices, things like that really support open access to their data. Without these, and data sharing agreement will inevitably be like it's really going to be a costly and ad hoc exercise that's just going to be taking subject matter experts away from agency operations, which is going to be a real challenge to getting some buy-in. For the Department of Education, our solution to this has really come in the form of our first ever agency-wide data strategy. Our agency's data strategy is really a recognition that we can and should do more to strategically use our data to improve student outcomes. You can find that strategy and broader discussion about them, the 19 objectives and the 4 goals within it in our online report. And if you're able to access it, that is a link later on for you to click on. But you also see a summary table here. You're gonna find those things that I've discussed before in terms of making sure that things are interoperable, data quality related issues, including things like enhancing agency processes for data sharing. The thing that I want to probably direct folks' attention to is goal 4. It's improving data access, transparency, and privacy, and especially objective 4.4, which is about enhancing information collection governance. For those of you familiar with the federal information collections process, it generally starts with a public comment period and OMB approval, something that typically takes about 6 months before you really have the authority to collect. And then it's a little difficult to change after that. So you really need to have things planned out in advance if you want to do things correctly. So we plan to enhance our own information collection request process to ensure that any planned collection aligns with FAIR principles. So making sure that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Things like before you draft a data collection instrument, you really need to begin with the end in mind. So how will you ensure that your data is being collected and managed in a way that meets those principles? I think there's a lot that can be discussed here, but far more probably than the time allotted. So I'm just going to invite folks to kind of take a look at the strategy. And as you look at those objectives, realize that they're intended to overcome some sort of outstanding challenge that the agency is trying to overcome. And as you think about that, think about the challenges that there would exist to data sharing if these things did not exist or we did not achieve these objectives. Next slide, please. So interagency efforts. As I mentioned, the Evidence Act, I think, went a long way to kind of mandating some certain requirements to prepare agencies and the whole of government to really share data. And this advisory committee, I think, is just one example of those. Non-statutory barriers, I think, still exist for individual agencies to enter into these data sharing agreements. And they're going to continue to exist until solutions are really developed to either decrease the perceived costs or increase the perceived benefit of engaging in these efforts. Some folks, especially those in our statistical community and on the room, may point to the Evidence Act provision for the presumption of accessibility for statistical agencies. It basically states that unless there's a statutory limitation, agencies must make available data assets to a statistical agency or unit for the purposes of developing evidence. I think there's a key phrase in there that it finds its way into a lot of statutory mandates, which states that agencies are only really required to do it to the extent practicable. For many agencies, especially those who have not really achieved those intra-agency efforts outlined in the previous slide, they're immediately going to find that these arrangements are not practicable. In instances where data are complex and subject matter experts are really an extremely valuable and rare resource, any arrangement that comes as a one-sided mandate may quickly find itself being impracticable from that agency's perspective. So what do we do? I think it's in its simplest form, and this is just me. It's you know, and it's not any real wisdom. It's just basic kind of rational choice modeling. We need to make sure that the perceived costs are outweighed by the perceived values for any data sharing arrangement. So as I mentioned before, one-sided mandates probably out. You'll still need to sell agencies on the return on their investment. I think this can go beyond purely evidence-based relationships. I think there's some operational things that agencies might actually value that would be benefited from these sorts of relationships. Also, those legal barriers and bureaucratic processes that I think the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking made. I think they talk about the analysis and paperwork creating MOUs. Those things still exist. Removing, streamlining, and standardizing those processes are really going to reduce those perceived costs to entering into a data sharing agreement. It's really in these areas that the CDO Council's data sharing working group are going to be engaged. And they're going to be identifying challenges. You know, it's either going to be legal, policy, technical measurement that really inhibit data sharing. And we're really going to be making recommendations, developing solutions, and executing the solutions that make data sharing easier with strong privacy provisions. So one thing I want to highlight for folks, we are still relatively new. We're talking a couple of months, so these solutions have yet to be developed. However, it's these discussions in this committee that have really informed those efforts, and they're going to continue to inform them as we meet kind of every month and hear new perspectives. It's my hope that before the conclusion of this committee, I'm able to report back and say, remember hurdles X, Y, and Z. We've got those covered, so stay tuned for that. So hopefully that's going to be coming relatively soon. Next slide, please. So I know this isn't really a time for questions. I think it's just a matter of habit that I kind of plug this slide in there. So I'm probably just an opportunity to discuss what I think we learned here. I think plenty of attention has been placed on technology, especially those catering to like secure transfer or integration of data across organizational boundaries. The solutions that we have are available, but I think we really need to be focusing on the people and the processes. Until these components are really resolved, those data sharing efforts will continue to just be an ad hoc and costly exercise inhibiting participation. Individual agencies are really going to have to take a lot of effort to ensure that their own data management practices lend itself to secure data sharing, but also the government has a responsibility to make sure that it's taking proactive steps to reduce those costs and increase that perceived value of data sharing. And I think with that, I'm going to be handing things off to Richard.
Thank you, Greg. So, you know, after I saw my colleague's slides, I was like, so what else can I add? So, you know, bear with me, but I'm going to add some texture to both of those presentations. You know, a bit about myself. So I have been the Chief Data Officer at EPA for a little over a year as permanent and a little bit longer than that in an acting role. My background is in ecology. I'm an ecologist by training, but since I've been at EPA, I've been largely working at the interface of technology and science, you know, trying to bring scientists and their data to sort of better IT tools and solutions. Next slide, please. So to kind of continue where Greg left off, you know, we have technology solutions. The way we're going to be successful in sort of creating a data commons or a data service, or, you know, sort of moving everybody to using more evidence more often in more places, will be by capturing their imagination. You know, the whole movement behind data science, you know, while nascent and has been driven for a long time, has been certainly, you know, kick-started by, you know, major IT innovation in collecting data, using data, taking advantage of it, and showing the value to businesses, to society, of sort of what we call big data. You know, that's a bit passé term, but the notion here is, you know, to Greg's point, as we have built better technology solutions, we need to bring people on board and drive their hearts and their imaginations to help us achieve the kind of change that we want. You know, Ted actually did a great job showing a possible path for this. You know, bring people to the art of the possible, show them how their data can sing in in visualizations, in better analytics shops, in the value of sort of centralizing our data and being able to share that. We certainly have done some of that here at EPA, but when I started, I came from building an analytics shop based on visual analytics and dashboarding, and throughout that process, I've certainly become aware that our agency is really good at sort of through our communities of practice and through our internal, sometimes truly siloed, but often sort of cross silos around some technology like geospatial technology, for instance. We're very good at building analytical tools and building sort of visualizations that we can use internally or that the public can use. What we're not very good at is managing our data, in a way that all of us can see it and all of us can better understand. And this is just internally mine. This is not even externally focused. Next slide, please. Actually, I will also mention, just because it's on the top of my head, we're also taking a run at ICRs and sort of how we can better improve our data collection through how we manage it. So where are we collecting data that's duplicative? Where are we collecting data that we never use? How can we better manage that process so we EPA are collecting data that we value most, so we can reduce burden. I would love to say it's all OIRA's fault. I'm sort of watching the chat. We have work to do on our end as well. It's not all OMB's fault. It's a process and it's burdensome on everyone. There's plenty of challenges to go around. So, what have I done in my short time here to try to address building, a people-focused data culture at EPA? So one of the first things I did, as many of you know, we're required to create a data governance body. Instead of making my data governance body, executive focused, mine is much broader. Mine has 60 people. Those are mostly people who are arms deep in data, in their data management. So I can bring the experts to the table to help advise me on how we move forward. So how did we get there? The first thing I did was say, hey, I need to go out to all of our 22 separate offices and regions across the agency and find out what our data challenges are, what's on top of their mind, where I can have the biggest effect. Ironically, post facto, I talked to sort of an expert in the field of building data governance strategies, and in his presentation, he said the one thing you don't want to do is ask people what their problems are, which of course is the first thing I did. That said, he's correct. If I went and did it again, I would get an equal number, but a different set of challenges that we have across the agency. What I did achieve by that was building trust and sort of getting buy-in. By going out and building that goodwill, talking to everybody, they sort of got that. Now there's somebody on the case. Now, the Office of Mission Support, which is my office, which sort of deals with data governance and IT data management across the agency, we're focusing on this a little more. So we get that people, building on their needs and somebody is listening to them. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway here is you must listen and report out. So, we heard their challenges, we shared the results, we walked through that and vetted some of their priorities so that we can, make sure that we're targeting the right things that will resonate the most with the community. It doesn't mean that it's entirely up to them. There are obviously challenges that rise above what the sort of mob says. And the notion there is by getting these 60 plus people and growing, that was through these conversations. Now I have this image here just to remind myself to talk about it a bit, that large agencies and probably small as well are really a microcosm of what we're trying to do. A lot of the things that we heard internally to EPA, we have been discussing over the months in these meetings. So, if the EPA is represented by this sort of I don't know, hippie band of fiddlers and guitarists. What we're trying to accomplish here really is how do we not just manage the local musicians, but how do we build and manage the orchestra of 100+ musicians and maybe a choral group as well. Next slide, please. And so this is the very high level takeaway of what we heard when we did those interviews. We have talked about a lot of these things here over the months, and there's no accident that I put data standards and data quality, because those came up in last month's meeting, and I spoke to them a little bit. But standards, data quality, data governance, the folks across EPA who are engaged in our data management have the same problems that we're seeing writ large. We don't have enough resources. There's not enough awareness internally of what our data holdings are. How do we make sure that when people are looking for a particular brand of data, they can find it in our internal data stores? Stewardship, a lot of this is the folks across our agency are looking for some sort of rules and leadership and guidance, and hopefully we're starting to provide that. I will also mention just briefly, not as a whine, but as a structural difference between Greg and Ted and myself is I don't have a staff. I'm not blessed with an office of people. I have a couple of folks who work directly with me. My position is very matrix, so I'm dealing with other executives and their staffs, and so far it's worked out remarkably well. In fact, it builds a little bit more requirement for cooperation, as opposed to just the Office of the Chief Data Officer is going to do this, and you must fall in line. That doesn't really work at EPA that well, but the notion of cooperativeness is central here. Next slide, please. So, I mentioned these two things that we've discussed a couple of times here. Standards and quality are not, monocultures. There's not one thing in each of these. So I'm going to show an example of one of our applications where we have done work on standards. We've built standards around format, around tagging, around transmission, but each use of our data or each domain, whether it be chemical safety or water quality, is going to require a different set of standards. And that is even, much more, it's going to become much more evident when we're trying to work across federal agencies. Quality, I want to thank Shelley. She pointed out to me the framework for data quality created by the Federal Commission on Statistical Methodology. This is their framework. Quality, has many, many aspects. These are just some of them. These are the ones that are in that framework. Other frameworks and other, methods of assessing quality have different qualities. The real takeaway here is that for any use of data, different aspects of quality are going to be more or less important and are going to have different, metrics and ways of assessing that. And the other takeaway here for quality, I'm losing my focus here a little bit on the people, but the notion of quality here is that it's often assumed, myself included, that quality is a static trait of data, and that is not true. Quality can change within a data asset or even across data assets. Next slide, please. Part of the job here, aside from just sort of getting people to understand, what the aspects are that they're asking us to create decisions on, is getting people to automatically share their data. Sort of if data are to be open, at the point of collection or shortly thereafter, we want to get people comfortable and willing and sort of, really wanting to share their data. And so how do we get that? One is people need to recognize benefit, whether that's for themselves, their group, the public writ large, in our case, the environment. But we have this, sort of recalcitrance often, and these are just some of the reasons. Some of them are very good. If the data are classified, obviously we can't just automatically share it with anybody. Others, are situational. So if the quality of our data are not going to be great for every purpose, people are reluctant to share them because they're afraid that their data will be misused. How do we argue against that? How do we promote better explanation, better situational awareness of what to do with those data, what they can be used for? There's the converse of that. Our data are so good and so fit for this purpose that if we share them, they're going to get sullied in a morass of data that aren't as high quality for that purpose. And people are they'll hide their gold data, as if they're in a keep with a dragon. And the notion there is, we got to get them to share it and point out how good their data are. And this is really the complexity of both of those. All data, most data are really complex, and they just require explanation and context. And once you get that context and get people who are going to be users of those data aware of what they can use it for, what they can combine it with effectively, that might be part of the solution here. Next slide, please.
And
so
everyone just want to do a quick time check because want to get some good discussion that's piling up. So
okay, I will. I'll try to breeze through some of these. So one of the things that we're working on is improving our the data that we collect and manage around regulated facilities. It's a complex topic. I don't need to go into that, especially in view of the time. What I'm trying to focus on here in terms of how we march through this at EPA is we have a lot of data. Some of those data are in the middle of this Venn diagram, that they're used by a multitude of business processes and programmatic activities. I want to focus on those iteratively so that we can improve the data management around those core data assets first, and then try to improve our business processes and our environmental outcomes as we improve those core data assets. Hopefully the ancillary data assets will follow by learning some lessons. Next slide, please. And so, this is an example of how we built some standards around data. So, How's My Waterway is an application that we built to demonstrate or to allow the public to access data and view sort of the quality of data of water around their locations. It's a pretty slick app. It's all built on APIs. Getting those APIs aligned and getting the data built in such a way that we could build this application took years. The APIs may have existed, but they may not have played well together. Even now that we have all of these elements in the underbelly of this iceberg, now that they're all harmonized and working well, there is still a lot of fat-fingered coding that needs to go on all the time. If one API breaks, the poor guy who manages the APIs has a dashboard which lights up when one of the data streams breaks. So we're not mature yet, even though this application looks pretty slick. There's still a lot of manual work that needs to go on every day or week to make this running. And so how do we get people to really see the value, harmonize it so that we don't have single points of failure around one developer? Next slide, please. So, this is sort of the high level. We're managing data, we're governing data. Too often we become controlled by those data that we manage. And then the converse, too often we try to control the data too much. We want to pigeonhole it and say, this is what you're going to be, data. And that's not really the case once you broaden it out to the entire world. So, my focus has been and I think Ted spoke to this as well, look at what people are using the data for, what it could be used for, what they need it for, and that will help us understand what we need to do in terms of building better data management practices, better standards, better quality, et cetera. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna skip this one. This is really just a summary on most of the things that I said. The end of the day, I would say we're focusing on people, building community, and that will hopefully build better solutions and better culture at EPA and beyond in terms of how we use our data. One thing that I didn't mention, and I should, is that both of the two examples, the facilities and the the water quality application example, those are partnerships. So the states and municipalities play a role in providing data, managing data, sometimes managing the data services for those applications. Next slide, please. And I will just leave it at that. You know, all of this will take time, you know, internally to EPA, it'll take time. At this scale of the federal government, it'll take even more time. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks to all, to Ted, Greg, and Richard for all the great and provocative discussion. We had a very lively chat going on that the public will see. First, let me, I will start, as we always like to do, with a couple public comments that I received. And I think one of them actually it was more of a clarifying question when I think someone used the term flat file. Does that mean a spreadsheet as opposed to something more dynamic or interactive? That was just a clarifying question from the public.
Yeah, that was me. When I think a lot of folks, when they ask, you know, I think they wanted to run an analysis, that it's just going to be some sort of simple matrix where it's like you have your observations on rows and you have your data elements in columns. So it is like a spreadsheet, but a lot of our systems are not set up that way. They're transactional, so there could be multiple records that you know, exist about a particular data point. You need to find out which is the most accurate record as of a particular point in time. And so I think it gets very complicated very quickly. So yes, that's kind of what I meant by a flat file. Is I think a lot of folks expect it to be in a simple spreadsheet or a CSV file.
Okay, great. And then another public question was someone pointed out, I think at some point during the education presentation about the some awareness for the public audience. So I appreciate the single application process that the ICSP, the International Committee on Statistic Policy, is working on under the Evidence Act, and asking how that work was being coordinated across the government. So I will actually ask if someone involved in the ICSP wants to talk for just very quickly about how that single application process is being discussed internally. Anyone? How about I do it? I will say we are. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to defer to Imelda because Imelda Rivers is leading an effort that brings together all of the agencies that are part of the ICSP. So one way that we're coordinating across government is through this coordinated effort that's bringing in the perspectives of each of the agencies that are in the ICSP to help design it. Second aspect of it is that we have a strong component of stakeholder outreach where we're trying to gather information from all the different potential users of the Common Application Portal so that we can understand what the current pain points are and what the successes of the pilot application portal that we put out for a smaller group of users so that we can build on that kind of information. But I see Imelda, and if she wants to add anything, you can please jump in.
No, I think that was a great job, Barry. I'm having problems unmuting fast enough. I think one of the things to keep in mind about the single application portal is it provides an opportunity for it to be a prototype for us to think about evidence building and what access looks like when you're working, as Greg and others talked about in their presentation, to come up with a standardized process. And so we will be relying heavily on the public to and our agencies and our researchers. I know Amy will be speaking shortly to give us feedback on how to structure that so that we do address, as Julius put in the comments, the value proposition of making this data available. So this is a big step for the government in terms of taking these resources and having that platform, that place where you can go and discover what data are available, and then also have applications submitted to use the data. And so we look very much forward to engaging with people on that. Thank you, Barry.
Thanks. And the follow-up question, I think I can address that. I think the single application portal is being developed in coordination with widely across the government, including with the CDO councils and through OIR as well, who has representation on all these councils, including both the CDO Council and ICSP. But let me, I will try to do an adequate job of summarizing the great chat that was going on, and then we'll throw it open for a few minutes of discussion before we go to break. On the, just for the public, I think the points that folks bring up, and maybe in order of importance for addressing, no, I'm just joking. I won't make that choice. The little discussion about the PRA, is it a barrier? Is it an opportunity for coordinating and actually affecting the quality and the burden? So I would just, a lot of discussion about that, about how that can be used, might be a barrier to information collection, also a tool in order to agencies to organize their information collection. I will say that the goals, the Paperwork Reduction Act, will exist with or without the Paperwork Reduction Act, which is balancing burden with practical utility and ensuring that you are collecting data with sound methodology and or trying to avoid duplication. And so we'll dwell on that too long now, but there was a good chat about that going on the side. So on the a couple of things that came up with respect to the dashboard discussion was, I think, a couple commenters were talking about, well, how do you actually identify and convey the quality, and I'll put that very much in quotes because I think that this crew does it. That can mean many different things. How do you do that in a dashboard? And dashboards are about visualization and making it useful for decision makers. But how do you convey that? Let me turn it over to the team, and also a lot about I think Julia introduced the term, the value proposition. How do you get these things worked or accepted? And I think that it's starting, again, with just clearly explaining the value of the tools that you're presenting and the collection itself. So I think those were kind of the biggest emerging themes out of the discussion of this. But I wanted to thank all the panelists. I think also a lot of things were like, people have a lot of links to look at. Because I think, if nothing, I've always been impressed by the depth of the consideration of the presentation of the data for decision making that this reflects. And so let me go to the questions, then I'll just try to get them in order. And so let me turn it over to the first person identified. So Nick Hart.
Thanks, Tom, and Ted, Rich, Greg, great presentations. So thanks for sharing your perspectives. You all are clearly doing a ton of work, and as a normal person in the American public, I'll say we really appreciate it. I guess I'm curious, particularly Ted, for just thinking about the CDO function that's happening across government. Your offices all seem to be quite mature in the sense that you are getting a lot of things done, but I'm assuming that not all CDOs are quite at the same level of maturity. So for this committee's charge in sort of thinking about how we build out a data service and engage in different data sharing linkage capabilities across government, I guess I'm wondering how limiting that might be for agencies that are still very early on in the maturity level and maturity production. And I guess most importantly, like, are there things that this committee should be thinking about and recommending in our report, the forthcoming reports, that could really kind of lean in here, both helping the community for the CDO Council, but maybe those individual agencies that are early stages of the maturity? Do you have any thoughts on, like, what do you all need, like, first order, that's beyond this discussion of identifying value proposition? I heard Rich say he's a one-person shop, and that concerns me. There's a lot to be done here. So are there obvious things that you all might suggest that this group think about?
Sure, Nick. I think I'll try to address that question, and maybe some of the other things that Dom was bringing up about the dashboard as well as part of that conversation. Weave them together here in the interest of time. But I think, so one thing is just to note is about 3 years ago, I started in the CDO position, maybe even a little bit less than that. And I was a single person without a staff or a team, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. That's not too long ago. Again, I think the point that Julia made and others have made about value, for us, I can't overestimate or emphasize the impact that the dashboards have had on the culture, right? So when we think about evidence, we think holistically about how do we get the culture to change, as Richard was talking about as well, and Greg. And I think, one thing is delivering that value to the agencies. We have 2 statistical agencies at USDA. We also have some very administratively focused agencies, right? And so where are you going to get the funding? Where is this all going to come from? Well, the fact is we do spend a lot on our existing infrastructure. But we've never thought about it as an enterprise, I don't think, in the past. And so, again, the idea that where I sit in the CIO's office, we would be leading an enterprise analytics program for the department 3 years ago would have been unthinkable, right? So it's not that long. And so I have hope that and that we'll work together and that we'll build upon some of the work that's happened in various agencies to get to where we need to go. When it comes to the questions about the dashboards, for example, it was a real big culture change. It was about making visible some of the data quality issues, right? Getting people to say, well, let's make available the best available data to the decision maker so they at least have access to that. But if there's a data quality issue that's been buried for years because we don't have data validation in some of our systems or some of the fields that we need, let's make it visible. Let's give them a confidence level in terms of the data. And so I think that was part of the real cultural shift. It was also that value generation and the speed of getting people to say, let's create one dashboard for HR where people could go to that one-stop shop. It caused people to think about, well, what other opportunities do we have, and looking at blending data across agencies. So from a resourcing perspective, I think what we need is just support of the idea that there is a lot of value, but also the interdependencies. We're not going to go from A to Z from the perspective of an administrative agency being able to catalog its data, make it open available to the public without, I think, giving that internal business value to transform it, because both of those things can be leveraged. When you integrate on a common platform and you're having an enterprise governance approach, it's a lot more cost effective now to talk about a platform for open data or a cataloging effort, right? Because one, you're getting internal value that can also be translated into the broader effort. So those are some of my thoughts. I know others will have similar or different perspectives, which is good.
So this is Richard. I would just add one thing there, which is data management itself is not really rewarded. So if we're going to, sort of value data, we need to figure out a way to reward or value the data management. Coming from a science background, publications are what the coin of the realm was, not publication of data. And until we get to the point where that aspect is valued more than it is, it's a long road to hoe.
Thanks, team. I think, again, let me jump back, and probably going to go into break in maybe about 7 minutes or so for just a few minutes. This is a great conversation, so hesitate to cut it off, but I think we all need to do that. A couple comments in the chat room about fit for purpose. And so if you think about these dashboards, I think this is really the interaction between presentation and data. They're there because people expect to be able to make informed decisions based on these. And so stepping back a little bit from the quality, it gets to what is the purpose of this and what is this data fit to use? I think that's a comment that's been going through the chain a little bit. It's very important to, that's what we've talked about in other sessions as well. And maybe at the risk of using another example, the census pulse surveys, again, we've talked about a lot, but the people understood that these were quick, probably less, or more uncertain, but trying to give a general trends, quicker picture. And I think that fit for purpose, I think, is something that probably the agencies that have gone down this dashboard route have been really thinking through. So I just wanted to introduce that concept. And then I think Chris Heffley, you may have had a comment as well. Or a question.
A question. I admire very much AG's dashboard system. And my impression is that you all applied for some IT modernization fund that was available, maybe got some help from ACDEB pulling that together. Could you give us a little on the history of evolving those dashboards?
Sure. So we did have an effort underway as one of our 2 agency priority goals, starting in the beginning of the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019. We did have some projects funded by a modernization fund, but it was not the analytics or dashboard project. We, however, did use internal resources to identify some funds for modernization. I think very, very modest in really starting with the dashboards, right? Iterative process for development, engagement, but largely it was about consolidating resources we already had. You know, we had Tableau servers across multiple mission areas, and we were able to bring them into a common platform. And I think actually, in many cases, save money as agencies were looking to move to their own cloud platforms. We did work with the GSA Centers of Excellence, and so we worked with 5 centers of excellence, from data center consolidation to customer experience, and one of them was on the analytics front. And so they helped us to accelerate some of our dashboarding work. When we were doing our mission area work, we had a team that was doing one mission area per quarter, and they were doing the other mission area. So we had a coordinated team, and they also did our data management maturity assessment. So that was very helpful to accelerate those efforts. But I think overall the investment was very modest. I think we started with something like $2 million. So for an agency of 19 agencies and the amount that we spend on data, it was very modest. And then from that, we built a culture around, if we're going to modernize, let's look at the opportunity to do it in a shared and coordinated way. And so happy to talk more about that with anybody who's interested.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. We maybe one more call for any comments or questions. Like I said to the audience, I think that there is a lot of discussion about fitness for use and data quality in the chat room. So I just wanted to ask if anyone else had any other thoughts or comments.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm really interested, obviously, by this notion of standards and measures that get developed. And I'm just, from my experience with LEHD and a bunch of other things, Anna is involved with something right now on unemployment to re-employment dashboards. Rather than having a top-down driven approach to developing standards, if you have them developed, and Ted talked about this a little bit and Greg as well, if you have them driven by the value proposition and that, you know, you get input, if you take a look at the output and the output doesn't make sense on the dashboard, you pretty quickly get a convergence in standards and measures and a data model. But it has to be driven from the use. If you start from the input side, you'll spend your life gumming up measures and standards and so on. What we did with LEHD, and Amy sent me this comment, which is what's precipitating it, none of those standards were mandated. That was all voluntary. And the data were not perfect to start with. But what happened was when you create products like the quarterly workforce indicators and the on the map, and states see that the numbers don't make sense, they start to converge. And so that was a state-driven activity to develop those, and it came out of the value proposition. And I'm going to put in the chat a workshop. Anna is speaking at it, that the states are running, which is looking at unemployment to re-employment and education workforce dashboards and training. And the data models and measures are coming out of the production of those products. And that's part of the conversation of those meetings. And the data governance, so it all flows through from the value. I'd like to hear what Ted thinks about that, or Anna.
So how about Amy had asked to make a comment as well, so I'll turn it over to her.
I'll go really quick, and then I'd love to hear the reflection on what Julia said from Ted and Anna. But I wanted to, what I heard in this session, which was a great session, is that the value proposition for the agency or the department to engage, like Ted had shown us, is that they got something out of it. They got these KPIs. And then what Julie and I have been going back and forth in the chat, and Anna joining in, is that if we want this to be for feds by feds, make a lot of dashboards and show the agents what they're doing, where the efficiencies are. But if we want this to be a national secure data service that supports the needs, the measurement needs at the state and local, we've got to address this value proposition. Are we thinking about resourcing this appropriately to achieve both of those goals?
Well,
So, anyone else? And then we'll go to break.
Chris, again, listening to the discussion, I often have trouble going from the theory, the big picture restraints to specifically how do you get your handle around this? While I'm listening, particularly to the Department of Commerce, that if we started a dashboarding effort like they did at AG, and that would help us discover the specific constraints, problems we had with bringing the right, where's the definitions? It'll take us from these generalizations to practical, and then also, then the dashboard, they get a product. So we get discovery of what gets in our way in a very tangible way, and then a product, which is always going to help your cause. I think the same with trying to suit state and local needs, that if we identify something that a product they would like and then attempt to build it, we'll be faster moving from this theory to the specifics, exactly what gets in our way. And the trying it could very well inform what's needed and what the barriers are. Just a thought.
Yeah, I think you're hearing some agreement. I think I was struck by something that was on Rich's slide. It's very much this. You know, the slide on the water was called "How are waterways doing?" basically, and that's often where you start from the decision makers. And I think there's sometimes a tension. I think Barry mentioned this in the chat as well. Well, I just want to know whether we're doing a good job or not, and all this stuff about quality and fitness for purpose and p-values. You know, just tell me whether something is good or something is not good, and translating that through a dashboard exercise to something that this community can provide to the decision makers. Absolutely. And so I think the comment was just like, you just got to start somewhere, and starting from, you know, what the questions that you're trying to answer is always where a wire tries to start as well. All right, so thank you. This was a great, I didn't get to all the public questions, I don't think, but those will be in the chat. Why don't we go to break? Let's do a little bit of a shorter break, try to come back by 10:30, and jump into the what I'll know will be an equally exciting discussion led by the external researchers. So thanks, everyone. This was great.
Thanks, Sam. We'll be back at 10:30.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We're back online, but I always check the thumbs up. Okay, great. So thanks, everyone, again. It's a very lively discussion. And so why don't we dive right in? So our next discussion will look into the issues, challenges, ideas from external researchers as they work with public sector data sets. And that's like I said, this is an opportunity for us to hear from folks who may have been a little bit frustrated with some of the aspects of working with the federal government data sets in the past. Let's beat around the bush here. This is institutions, as you know, academic institutions, NGOs, private sector, any other stakeholders. So there's a wide range in diversity and the nature of the type of the interaction with the outside researchers and other stakeholders with federal data. So without further ado, we have some great folks that lead this discussion. We have Len Berman. He's a fellow at the Urban Institute's Tax Policy Center and the Paul Volcker Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and Ken Trotsky, who is the Richard W. Janus H. First Endowed Chair in Economics at the University of Kentucky's Gatton School of College of Business and Economics. And we do also have, and I don't have your title right in front of me, Amy, so I apologize, Amy O'Hara, who you've heard from before, We're going to try a little bit differently now. She's going to do a little bit of a presentation and will also serve as the facilitator for some of the questions, ideas, and the insights in this version. As being an external researcher, I think she's extremely well positioned to provide that perspective. And I will also be chiming in once in a while to run with things. But this is going to be great. So thank you, Len, Ken, and Amy. And I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going first. Just a couple of comments. I am currently at the University of Kentucky, but I did start out my career at the United States Census Bureau, working for the Center for Economic Studies. So I have had a little experience in, using data inside government, and so a little bit of that perspective. Although I left there a long time ago, I had I didn't have any gray hair when I left, and I want to. I thought the presentations, the last presentations were fantastic. I learned quite a bit. I also learned that I think I need to get some folks to work on the graphics in my slides, because my slides are just not going to compare to the slides that we've seen from others. I want to sort of illustrate some of the issues that I perceive as an outside researcher through the lens of a project that I worked on a number of years ago, actually. I think that we're on the third administration since I was involved in this project, and it was part of a research contract with the Department of Labor to evaluate one of their programs. At that point, the Workforce Investment Act program. Give a little background, and it is sort of I think it's an interesting perspective because it comes into this issue of, I'm doing work for a federal agency, but have to use administrative data provided by states and some of the issues that involves. And so, yeah, next slide, please. So again, I want to demonstrate both the usefulness as well as some of the challenges by discussing this project that I worked on, a lot of what I'm going to say has been you've heard before, so I'm going to second a lot of the issues that people have mentioned and pointed out, and sort of but make it clear, yeah, we can see it from the researcher standpoint as well, and perhaps add a little emphasis to some of these issues. So basically, this project was an evaluation of what was then the Workforce Investment Act, the main federal job training program that existed at the time. And I want to, again, illustrate some of the problems and the benefits of using administrative data to perform this evaluation function. Next slide. Just a little sort of a background. So WEA was implemented in, I believe it was 1998, through federal legislation. It replaced what was the Job Training Partnership Act, which was the act that was in effect at prior to WEA. As part of the legislation, there was supposed to be an evaluation of WEA that was completed by 2005. That evaluation wasn't done by 2005. The GAO criticized the Department of Labor for a number of years about not completing this, and eventually they got around to deciding that they were going to do this. The Department of Labor launched sort of two evaluations sort of simultaneously. One was going to be a non-experimental evaluation of the Workforce Investment Act. That's what I was involved in. And then shortly after, there was enacted what they referred to as the gold standard. I guess ours was the silver standard of experimental evaluation, which was launched at the same time. So this was launched. We started our project somewhere around November of 2007. I think we officially got the contract a little bit earlier. The first thing that happened was the Department of Labor, through their Office of Policy Development and Research, issued a training and employment notice. So they sent a training and employment notice to all administrators of the WIA program at all of the states, all 50 states, requesting them. There was an action requested that they provide us with the data from the states to conduct our non-experimental evaluation. We needed data both on, obviously, as we heard before, people who were actually part of the WIA program, but also information on people who were similar to them that we could do some comparisons with using appropriate statistical techniques. So this training and employment notice went out to all 50 states. 13 states indicated that they were willing to provide data to us. Of that 13, 12 of them did manage to provide data, and one of them gave their best shot, but didn't seem to be able to provide us with the data, or determined at the time that perhaps the cost of providing us with the data did not exceed what they perceived was going to be the benefits from the results of this program. I should say that I'm going to comment. I'm going to discuss sort of what happened, my impression of what went on based on sort of my experience as part of this project, as well as a discussion with folks at the Department of Labor and their experience and their thoughts on what happened as part of this. So we got data from 12 states. I will also say, we needed a comparison sample. 12 obviously is, we were hoping for at least 25. We got 12. It's somewhat disappointing. We were also needed comparison samples, groups that didn't actually participate in WIA, but were similar enough that we could form comparison groups. Hopefully the same sources for these data. From 4 states, our comparison group consisted of people who had applied for unemployment insurance. And for 8 states, our comparison group came from people who had participated in Wagner-Pfizer employment security type, had gone to an employment security office and applied for some help at some point during this period. So again, we didn't have common comparison groups. States weren't able to provide that to us. Again, somewhat disappointing. But we took measures to adjust for the fact of some of these challenges. Our main findings from this quote-unquote evaluation was we found positive impacts on earnings and employment for adult workers. That is, the WIA program, and as does the current Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, which replaced WIA, which is known as WIOA, they have sort of 3 groups of workers that they serve. Adult workers, those are people who are economically disadvantaged, who have traditionally faced barriers to working. There's dislocated workers. Those are people that have lost their jobs recently and are looking to find a new one. We found that the WIA training programs had a positive impact on both earnings and employment for the adult workers, those disadvantaged workers, but almost no measurable impact for dislocated workers. For adult workers, turns out, and again, we are doing an evaluation in which almost typically involves some sort of cost benefit. Does the cost of the program exceed or is less than the benefits that the participants receive? In this case, the adult worker, the benefits appeared to exceed the costs. Wasn't true for dislocated workers. Next slide. So we submitted our report in December of 2008. Just for those of you who recall, December 2008 was sort of an interesting time in the country. We were in the midst of the financial crisis and rolling into the Great Recession. We were also changing administrations. The administration that formally requested our report was then the President George W. Bush. In December 2008, when we turned in our report, the Bush administration was leaving and the administration of President Obama was beginning. And at the time, sort of, I would say the report from an administrative standpoint sort of got a little lost for several reasons. One of the reasons was there's an element of the evaluation community that feels like non-experimental evaluations have little value and don't produce meaningful results. try to provide a little evidence to suggest that was wrong. And then, of course, the Obama administration coming in had, a large funding package designed to help people in the midst of the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And as part of that, lots of money that were flowing to dislocated workers to help them find reemployment. And so our results didn't tend to support that funding opportunities. And so they certainly, they didn't ignore it, but that wasn't, they didn't want to emphasize it. It did get some attention in the press. We got some front page New York Times, admittedly below the fold on a Saturday, coverage of our report. But I think in the long run, what we did have some impact and some meaningful impact that I think helped improve the program. One of the things was that when the program was reconstituted as WIOA a number of years later, the WIOA program provides even more flexibility for administrators to move money from the dislocated worker program to the adult worker program. They still throw funding into the dislocated worker program, and I can tell you I serve on my local WIB board that oversees the local WIOA program. Programs have a lot of flexibility to sort of take money in the dislocated worker program because they can't find a lot of dislocated workers and to move it into the adult worker program. This is particularly important in periods with low unemployment, such as what we saw prior to 2020 when there just really aren't a lot of dislocated workers. And I think, and my impression is from a number of sources that administrators saw the results that perhaps they weren't providing services that were beneficial to dislocated workers and worked to improve the program. There was actually a recent article in the Wall Street Journal sort of laying this out. There was this report in the article came out in 2013. There's this DOL report that suggested that we weren't helping dislocated workers. So here are all the things that we did in, the workforce development folks did in the response to this report that improved the services provided to dislocated workers. And in particular, a lot of that was more sectoral or industry-focused training programs and working more closely with local businesses. And again, my experience in working with the program in my local area suggests that these programs are now more successful, although I will say I don't believe that there's been a systematic evaluation at this point. We also learned that there were lots of differences across states in how they treated workers when they walked through the door, who got sent to, job search services first and how many just got put into training services. So I think that folks did learn about cross-state differences in how these programs were run that I think they found valuable. Next slide, please. So what are some of the advantages from administrative data as opposed to data collection efforts, new data collection efforts? Well, I think one of the things is the timeliness and the cost. So our study, I say it took 15 months. I think a better number would be 13 months to produce at the cost of $1.5 million. I will say much of that 13 months did involve taking the data from all of these different sources, all these different states, and trying to ensure that all of the variables, correspond. We're measuring the same thing. How there are different measures of race. Did they have separate measures for ethnicity? How they measured the education categories, various things that took some time to standardize and understand all how what all the variables were in these data sets, because we didn't get a lot of documentation with them, and so that was a large part of that that 13 months took to do that. I would say, in contrast to our results, that randomized control trial, that gold standard that everybody referred to, it took 10 years to complete. It actually was completed long after the WIA program had ended and was reconstituted as WIOA and cost $23 million. Turns out the results from this randomized control trial largely mirror our results. Maybe we got lucky. Maybe we didn't. Maybe we did follow some practices that were known to ensure that our results were going to match the results of RCT, and apparently we did a pretty good job. I will say there is a paper that's been around for a bit that Julia's a co-author on with several other people that as part of this program they got data from another state and sort of replicated our analysis and then went on to do some other things, but used our same methodology and came up again with some very similar results. So I think there's some evidence to suggest that that what we did was reasonable, did produce some pretty reasonable results, similar to what you'd get from a randomized controlled trial, a lot more timely. It's important to recognize that RCTs are important, but they're expensive, and it takes a while to do that. I think, appropriate evaluation policy would involve both RCTs periodically, but then the use of administrative data on intervening periods, because it produces evidence much quicker at much lower cost. And therefore, again, some of our results then did actually inform the policy, the reauthorization, and the formation of the WIOA program. So if you want, part of the issue with any sort of evaluation is, can you influence, do you actually have an influence on policy? And I think you need to produce some timely results to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So some issues with using administrative data. One of the things that it's important to recognize is that a lot of programs that help people, in order to evaluate those programs, you need to know something about earnings or wages, earnings, some sort of measure of earnings, and then a measure of whether does it change earnings, does it move them out of poverty, and does it help them find jobs. Though there are sort of two sources of data that primarily would give you a national source of data for that type of information. One is IRS tax data, and one comes from the unemployment insurance system. Both of them have their strengths and benefits, but both of them are incredibly challenging to get access to. So if you want to do this type of analysis, you've got to jump through a lot of hoops. Again, and some of these issues are dated, admittedly, but I think some of them, as we've heard, are still present. You've got to get permission from all 50 states to get these data. We managed to get it from 12. Again, inconsistent information that we were provided and inconsistent formats, and so that took a lot of time. If anything, I would say since we conducted our study, the needed data, such as the UI wage record data, has become less available. LAHD is a fantastic project, but there is, the permissions that you have as part of LAHD, there are some states that you can get automatically. There's some states that you have to still ask data for on a case-by-case basis. And my understanding is there are actually some states that actually refuse to participate at all. And so that has become an issue. I will say another project I'm working on right now, luckily we got the data sent to us and we were able to analyze it. I think that's probably, if we were doing it again, that would not be the case. I'm working on a project right now in the state of Kentucky in which I want to use our administrative data resources. And the way I have to do it is I write code, I get some test data, I test the code on the test data, and then I send it to folks, state employees, ignoring the fact, of course, that I'm a state employee, but I'm not the right state employee. Send it to people, other state employees in Kentucky, who then run the code on the data, look at the results, decide which ones I can see, send me back what I can see. And it's a very, and when doing program evaluation, it's often an iterative process where you need to see the match quality and try to understand. This is a very challenging way to conduct meaningful research and evaluation. It makes that process very kludgy, for lack of a better word, and oftentimes is not the highest priority for the folks at the agency where I have to work through to get the data. Having said that, the folks from Kentucky that I've been working with have been fantastic, incredibly helpful, but they are working under rules that make this a very challenging aspect. Next slide, please. I think there are other work that we've seen using administrative data that have had substantial impacts, even us setting aside the work of Raj Chetty and all of his co-authors that has gotten substantial attention. I'll point out two other ones. I think Bruce Meyer's work at Census, which has just been an incredible effort to pull all of this administrative data together to improve our measures of poverty and income inequality, and has demonstrated, in my mind, how effective transfer programs have been in lifting people out of poverty. But despite Bruce's best efforts, and anyone who knows Bruce knows how thorough he can be, he's still missing important state-level data. He has SNAP data from again, 12 states. I don't think it's the 12 states I have, at least the last I heard. And so he still struggles to get SNAP data and housing data as well that are important components in terms of transfer programs. Next. And then there's also, we've heard about the joint research between HUD and NCHS linking administrative data that examines the impact of lead paint on children's health in public housing. Again, fundamentally important and a great project, which again can be demonstrates, I think, the importance of using administrative data to help improve programs and more importantly improve the lives of those who are trying to being served, which is ultimately should be the goal. Next slide, please. So ways to move forward, and you know, I was a commissioner on the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Making, so not surprisingly, a lot of my comments are going to revolve around our report. But you know, I think we've heard about this common portal, and would be a great improvement. Some sort of centralized mechanism for researchers, policymakers to access both federal and state level administrative data. The National Secure Data Service idea, I think, is a clear, if we want to continue to do this, and we need to figure out a way to make this happen, something where we can actually conduct, particularly for some of these programs, national and additional to regional or state level evaluations of these programs, clear guidelines of who can access these data, and again, have this service or whatever to continue to push and for the best and most advanced technologies, the best ways to protect privacy of individuals. Next slide, please. And some other things I think I learned as part of this is obviously, you know, I will say I thought we did a good job. We produced a report that we were told to produce, but I think in my career of doing program evaluation, at many times it's become a bad word for a lot of program administrators. The concept of evaluation is, as an evaluator, you are assessing whether you should shut down my program. And that's actually not, in my mind, the best use of evaluation. And also much of this, you know, benefit for the average participant, costs for administering the program aren't particularly useful for actually running and improving the program. And researchers need to think about how they can produce results that are more useful for program administrators and interact with program administrators and discover that. Much of research, researchers focus on methodological questions. That's how we get publications. I cannot tell you how many papers there have been on how to estimate standard errors in a non-experimental matching situation. And I think most program administrators don't really care how you estimate the standard errors. They are more concerned about the actual estimates of the program, and not only just the estimate of the average treatment effect of the program, but estimates for certain subgroups of the program. Are there ways some people are doing it better? Are there ways to, how do you give me guidance for how to improve the program? Because ultimately that's the goal. People who are involved in administering these programs want to help people. If you can show them how to help them better, they're all about it. That has been my experience. And again, you need timely, forward-looking results. Can I do better going forward? You know, the only thing I'm going to be able to tell you is based on the data that I've seen in the past, but how can we take that and understand ways to move forward, to improve things, and how can we get those data in a timely fashion? So researchers bear a large part of that responsibility for figuring that out. I think we need to demonstrate to policymakers and program administrators how we can help. We've talked about that before. And I think, you know, the Coleridge initiative that we've heard about a little, that Julia's involved in, I think is a great start to this effort. Nice. Next slide, please.
And just it sounds like you're close, but just a time check.
Two more points. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. So I will also say we've heard a lot about what's going on at the state level and the interactions among state officials, and we've heard a lot about what's going on at the federal level and interactions about federal programs, and learned some great things. What I really haven't heard about is the interaction between federal officials and state officials in moving forward. Where are the working groups that involve both of those? And there may be, and I may just be ignorant about them, but there are a lot of programs that are joint federal-state programs, including the unemployment insurance program, where it would be interesting to hear. I'd like to hear some more about programs in which federal officials and state officials are working together to figure out common goals, common interests. You know, how do we this value proposition that we heard talked about, and to tee up a little bit, but what I think we're going to discuss in the next month is. We hear a lot about protecting privacy, but I'm not sure we all have a common definition of what that means. We hear a lot about the privacy budget, but what I don't hear is thinking about how much privacy is enough, and maybe how much when we go overboard, and thinking about this privacy budget in the real world. This comes from a person for whom, if you want to know how much I make, you go to the Lexington Herald Leader, Kentucky.com, go to their data section, go to the salaries of state employees at the University of Kentucky and type Trotsky, and you will get my income. You will know my income in seconds. I mean, as a matter of fact, there are two Trotskys that are working for them, my wife as well, so you know the household income. So concern about protecting my income that's already publicly available, I'm wondering how valuable that is, particularly, I mean, I know that's a state function, and most state employees suffer with, or are subject to these rules. But it's not just Kentucky. I mean, you could do the same thing at the state of Missouri where I used to be. Everybody knew my income as well. So I think we need to think about the research. We need to demonstrate the benefits of this research in improving programs, and we need to recognize those benefits and how that gets traded off with the cost of limiting access in severe ways. And things that we do to the data that make them more challenging to use. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. This is fascinating work. I'm going to talk about a somewhat different perspective, although I was actually motivated by a lot of work using administrative data myself, and I've been trying to think for decades about how we can safely expand access. Ken is right that we need to figure out what the privacy measure is and how to enforce it, what the trade-offs are. We're not that close yet, but I'll talk about that a little bit now, and I think we're going to talk about it some more next month. So the approach we use is called synthetic data and a validation server. And please go to the next slide. So this picture kind of conveys my optimism about synthetic data. So synthetic data, as I'll discuss, are data that aren't actually taken from they're not the administrative records, but they're a statistical representation of them. And we produced our first synthetic data product that is being reviewed by SOI right now. And I think it was pretty good. Pretty good in the sense that the Moog synthesizer in 1970 was pretty good. It was the first big electronic music generator. It was giant, expensive, and it could produce otherworldly sounds, but it wasn't real music. But if you think about where electronic music is now, or ask your kids about it, which I had to do, It's really good. It can do things that acoustic instruments can't even do. And synthetic data are useful for some purposes now, but in a lot of other ways, they're not that great. But I think they will be in the future. And in parallel with the validation server, they're enormously valuable. Next slide. So this chart just shows that we have lots of people who are working on this at the Urban Institute, at Statistics of Income Division. We've had help from John Chaika, who probably a lot of you know. We've had enormous support from people at the IRS, including Barry Johnson, who's on, and a number of his colleagues. Next slide, please. So just I guess an overview is we're talking about synthetic public use file. Right now, the IRS releases tax returns that have been altered to protect the privacy of the records, but that's become increasingly challenging over time. We're also trying to set up this validation server model, which would allow people to run programs against the actual data. This is collaboration with SOI, as I mentioned. We've had support from the Arnold Ventures, which got us started on this project several years ago. We're now getting support from the National Science Foundation, NCSES, thank you, Imelda, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to actually develop the validation server. And nothing I say should be attributed to any of those people, especially if I'm wrong. Please, next slide. I forget. Click through so that all the little bullets come up. Synthetic data are data designed to look like the confidential data. It's a different model than taking actual records and then manipulating values to try to protect privacy. This model is one where you try to figure out what the underlying distribution that kind of generated the data was and draw values from that distribution. So you can imagine if you had a data set of two variables that were jointly normally distributed, that bell-shaped thing. You could draw a bell curve, two-dimensional bell curve, and it would be a really good representation of the underlying data, but it wouldn't be any of the actual records. There are two kinds of synthetic data. Full means all of the values are synthesized. They're all drawn from the distribution. Partial just synthesizes the sensitive values. And we're working with SOI to try to produce fully synthetic text data sets. Next slide, please. Please click through. Yeah, thanks. Why synthetic data? Protecting confidentiality in public data sets never been more challenging. The big problem is that there's a huge amount of information available in other databases and online other resources, and conceivably it'd be possible for somebody to link to information on a particular tax return or some other sensitive data record and be able to figure out that, oh, this is their tax return, so therefore all the other information is now revealed. You can't allow that. If there ever was a disclosure of a tax return, as far as I know, there never has been. But if there were, Congress would just shut down the research, and it would be, and I think that's true for all of the data sets that you're stewards of. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the validation server basically the synthetic data could be useful for a lot of purposes. We're hoping we can use it to run a tax model, which we do at the Tax Policy Center. But it's not likely to produce reliable estimates for complex statistical models. The validation server would allow people to develop their programs on the synthetic data, make sure that they run, they don't generate errors, and then send the programs to the server where they would run on the actual administrative data. And then there's basically noise is added to some of the estimates, to protect privacy. If the estimates are very sensitive to some outliers, there might need to be a lot of noise. For estimates that aren't sensitive, there might be virtually none. The results are statistically valid You could publish them in a journal. And conceivably, this would be a way to allow much wider access to the tax data with a robust privacy guarantee. Now, there's some issues that we haven't worked out entirely, like what is the privacy standard? The one we know how to do the math for is differential privacy. It's a really extreme model of the threat to the data, and the amount of information that can be released or the amount of noise that would be added can be quite large. We're looking at alternative relaxations of differential privacy that would allow for, who basically allow for a lot more research with a lot more precision and still protect privacy to a standard that's consistent with the actual threats to the data. Next slide, please. Skip that. There is a synthetic SIP, which was developed by people at Census. It's great. The difference between ours and that one primarily is that ours is a fully synthetic file. The synthetic SIP is only partially synthetic. Tax data are a potential goldmine for research, and you might think that, well, I'm not interested in tax, but there's so much information on these files, like about income distribution, mobility, where people live, and it's really useful for research. The best articles, can you go to the next slide? The best articles that I've written have been when I've had access to the administrative data, either when I was working at Treasury or CBO or through programs that the IRS has set up to allow access. The IRS does a lot to try to share their data with the public, and they do an incredibly valuable service. They produce an annual public use file, produce very detailed tables for all of the data products, not just for individual income taxes, but others. They have a joint statistical research program that allows outside scholars to access the data for research, but the access is limited, first by the law, Section 6103J of the Internal Revenue Code, and by IRS resource constraints. Working with researchers and making sure there's no data breach is really time intensive for the IRS. Next slide, please. And actually I'm going to skip over this one as well. Next slide, please. So the key thing is that there have been really valuable applications of tax data to other purposes. I think when the earlier presentation talked about the education scorecard, that uses tax data to look at people's incomes after college. Raj Chetty has done a couple of projects where he's looked at income mobility, the importance of kindergarten teachers on income later in life. And there's so much more that could be done if there were a safe way to expand access. Next slide, please. So I've already talked about the threats to administrative data releases. The IRS has done a lot to try to protect the data, but because the threats have been growing over time, the amounts of distortion to the data that they need to introduce have been growing and in ways that I think can undermine its research value. Just the next bullet. And that we actually need a protection standard that not only works for the current threats, the amount of data that's out there, but things that might appear in the future. Next slide. And the one after that. So, okay, I've talked about this. The goal is to simulate the statistical process that produces the administrative data. And the question is whether by doing this we can actually produce a good and safe data set. And I have a simple thought experiment that I think proves that, at least in theory, you could produce really good synthetic data. And I call it the random rapture theorem. And the random rapture theorem just says, this kind of takes the biblical concept of a rapture, which I don't really understand because I'm Jewish, and says, suppose you just took 100,000 people and made them disappear. And they not only disappear, but they never existed, but they leave their tax returns behind. That data set is a perfect synthetic data set. It would be as good as any other random draw from the overall distribution, It guarantees privacy because by definition, those people don't exist, and you could use it for all sorts of research purposes. So the question is, can you find that random rapture data set? And the answer is you can't right now. But what we think of this project is doing is kind of starting the ball rolling. And one thing I found encouraging is that when we've published our methodology, people have come back and said, well, you could try this, you could try that, or we've updated it. Everything we're doing will be made public. There's a GitHub repository that has all of our programs. Skip the next slide, please, and go to the one after that. So the method we're using for synthesis is called classification and regression trees, and it actually works better than other methods of trying to capture this highly complex nonlinear distribution. But we're working on improving that methodology as well. Skip the next slide. This slide just basically says we want the data to be good, useful, not just in its own right, but also to match, to be used. Basically, if you do analysis on the synthetic data, you should get similar results to the analysis you get with confidential data. This talks about disclosure risks, and I'm going to skip that as well. Next slide, please. This just talks about the data set that we produced, which is using information that the IRS has had for a long time. We've produced a synthetic version of what's called a non-filer database, which is people with income so low that they don't actually have a filing obligation. You need that if you want to look at the whole population and not just people who file tax returns. And we produced something that looks pretty good. And please, next slide, and skip the, and go to the one after that. So we've talked a little bit about why a validation server is useful. First, the synthetic data, at least at present, we don't have the random rapture file, probably won't produce statistically valid estimates for a lot of kinds of queries. Second, we'd like to automate the statistical disclosure control process that would allow more research using sensitive data, avoid lengthy clearance process, and it would enforce, next bullet, that it would enforce consistency and privacy protection without spending valuable senior staff time. Next slide, and can you go to the one after that, please? So the challenges, which I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in the next meeting, is, well, a lot more, but defining an appropriate privacy standard. There's been a lot of comment about differential privacy and Census's effort to use that to release their data products. And I think Census is moving beyond that, which is really exciting, and we're trying to figure that out as well. And I am going to stop, but there are, on the next slide, you see there are some references to papers with a lot more information, and I want to hear what Amy has to say. Thank you.
All right. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to be talking and sharing some comments about what Ken and Len have presented and tying it into what I think the charge of the committee is, and also some additional chatter that we've had in our chat, as well as that we hear playing out, especially about privacy, as both of the previous speakers had mentioned. So recapping Ken's paper, it was really fantastic, and it showed the strength of using secondary data for evidence building. And I want to stress that these are data that were already collected for other purposes. They were administrative data. It was not a new initiative to collect data from a set of people like in the RCT that he referred to. So he was looking into how a federal law had played out. And I want to remind you, as he did, that he was only able to use 12, not all states. And he pointed out that they would have had 13, but that final state said that the cost of providing data didn't exceed the benefits they thought that they would receive. And I think it's interesting, and we should really hear from the folks at the state and the local agencies, what are those costs that they're perceiving? Are they dollar costs? Are they perception costs? Are they risk costs? Are they data security costs? And so I think that it would be interesting to figure out what the disincentive to providing data would be. And I'd like to remind you that even though it didn't take him as long as the RCT, it still took him a while to get his study done. And I'm curious what would happen if he wanted to repeat this today. If he were going to use the LEHD data, that's where the data are currently coming in from all the state unemployment insurance wage programs, he'd still only get 12 states. There are 12 states that say yes, and then the rest of the states is a negotiation. And as Ken pointed out, there are some states that are disinclined to have their data used in research projects. And if he were using the FSRDC network to access the LEHD, he'd have to manage IT constraints, potentially an application safe list, and also disclosure avoidance standards that are unlikely to be as probably simple as they were when he did this study some years back. But what I'm really interested in, how can others follow Ken's footsteps, but with fewer obstacles? So thinking beyond just Ken redoing his study, what if there were more Kens? What if we wanted lots of people to be able to evaluate programs using the data? So are you going to be able to overcome a 12-state limit? Are you going to be able to negotiate agreements? How do you have more flexibility in the uses of the data? Or are you going to go directly to the states themselves, like the Coleridge Initiative is doing, and kind of creating another pathway to data access? So when we think about what a National Secure Data Service is intending to do, it's trying to standardize and reduce barriers. It would be nice if it were a one-stop shop, but what if it is a multiple stop shop? What if we have various ways that incentivize different data holders to allow their data to be used? Maybe some of them are helping data get into dashboards. Maybe some of them are helping data get into evaluations. Maybe some of them are getting data into other more open-ended research projects. How would we structure that? How would we incentivize that? I think that ties into the charge of the committee. So whenever we're thinking about what Ken had also mentioned, like Bruce Meyer's work, Bruce's work is great, but it would have been even better if he had more states. As Ken pointed out, he also had access to about 12 states for TANF. I think that the Census Bureau has about half or more than half of the states for SNAP or TANF data, but how do you incentivize access to more of that data, right? So here's a big question. Ken used the state wage data because he couldn't use the IRS data. How would you get that going? And that's why it's great that we also had Len's paper that talked about how to increase access to the wage data. But the story, while lots of us want to do evaluation looking at labor force participation, earnings, wealth building, things like that, it isn't only about wage data. So we have to think through, there's this whole suite of data, as the earlier presentations today showed us. They weren't fixated on, how do we measure outcomes? The only good outcome is employment and earnings. It talked about the data from lots of different agencies that we have to grapple with. So whenever Ken mentioned the article in one of his slides about COVID displaced workers, it highlighted the local issues that need to be tied in. He pointed out that there were cross-state differences in how the programs are run, and there is a need to engage the local economic development officials. So here's a big idea. How do you build bridges between research, policy, and practice, right? How do you replicate what Ken was done? And he mentioned the study that Julia and her co-authors did. Bear in mind, that got done pretty quickly too, and for well under 23 million. I bet Julia wished that she got 23 million to do it, but it's administrative data offer a pathway to get a lot of evidence built, but the really effective evidence is going to be able to make it accessible to the policymakers and engage the practitioners, the people that are on the ground, really figuring out what needs to be done in their communities. I also noticed that Ken mentioned that he's currently working on his new project, getting direct data access, tying into what I said a few minutes ago. Is there a way that a National Secure Data Service is really a federated set of resources, of functionality, instead of a big thing at an agency. So how would you conceive of that? So now I want to flip to Len's paper, which is how you increase access to IRS data. It is fantastic that they are taking this path into the development of synthetic data. I think it's going to be really hard to do fully synthetic data where you're taking my entire tax return and making sure that you've changed enough of all of the different pieces and parts of it. And that way it is fully synthetic. People can use it without risk of identifying that I was a taxpayer or figuring out what any of my exemptions might have been. So when I think about synthetic data, this is not one of the ways that Len put it, but you could create synthetic data by giving a room full of toddlers typewriters, and you could have them hammer away at the typewriters and they would create data, right? But it wouldn't be any good. So Len and Claire and the rest of their team could produce really, really good synthetic data, but what if it's too good? What if it looks too much like me whenever you synthesize my tax return? So they are going to be turning this dial between privacy and accuracy to get a synthetic file produced. But that's very, very challenging, as I mentioned a minute ago, because imagine that I want to do a study on the earned income tax credit, and I want to be looking at differences between married and head of household filers. So they might have done the numbers really good, but if there's also a little bit too much noise whenever you're thinking about the household composition that's on a tax return, it's going to mess up my analysis. And now let's say that Len is looking at the impact of paid leave laws that have been passed in some states. Well, if they've over-noised the difference between some of the states that have these laws and some of the states that don't, his analysis isn't going to be any good. And as I mentioned before, what if Ken wanted to redo his study and he wanted to do the whole country, not just 12 states? Well, depending on how they're creating the synthetic data, it might not be good enough. So that's a challenge with synthetic data. But the great news is, and I think Len was getting through this really quickly, is that they're also doing a validation server. And that means that even if the file of fake data that would be able to use for our research had a little bit too much noise in it, they would have this functionality to have our analysis run on the internal data so that we could really see whether our results are robust on the internal data. This is incredible. This is a big, hard research project that I am thrilled is being pursued. I'm so happy that Barry is supportive of this and that they got money to be doing this. And they're using the validation server would be able to hopefully support all of those examples that I just gave if I were doing EITC and Len were doing a study and Ken were doing a study. So that's really good. But a big question to me is how much effort it's going to take to update all of their models if there is a large or even a small change in the Internal Revenue Code. So what if you have a big change to Schedule A in the way that itemized deductions are on there? What if you have a big change in the way that student loan debt is being handled on page 1 of the 1040? How is that going to be updatable in this set? Or what if there's a big change in privacy preferences, which I think is even more of a threat? So, there have been multiple mentions of what census is doing. That's great. The census is really important. I don't want to see it wag the entire statistical world, and I don't want to see it have some sort of negative effect on how measures are developed for state and local agencies that really need accurate data. So I think it's going to be important to think through how privacy preferences are changing over time. And a big question here, another big question, is that who gets to decide what amount of privacy is right? And that's kind of a teaser for what we're going to be talking about next month. And there's a lot of really good work that can get done, but if the results are protected to oblivion, why bother? So these are the sorts of things that while we're pursuing broader access, while we're pursuing synthetic data and validation servers, those are kind of the questions that are appearing in the background there. So I think that my takeaways would be that we really need to invest in these institutions. We need to invest in these approaches, and we need to invest in the conversation about the risks of data use and data publication and what you need to put noise on and protect versus the risk of not knowing the answers, not knowing what's going on. And I think that this is seldom discussed, but it's really critical. And Ken had a nod to this with the important work that went on between HUD and NCHS looking at lead in public housing. You know, you may not have had really crystal clear consent or awareness that that linkage was being done, but the public health benefit so overwhelmed that concern that we really needed to know the answer. So something else that this is thinking through both the earlier sessions and this is my last comment here. Researchers and practitioners are really going to be the best pitchmen with the states and localities, thinking through the what's in it for me. And this is something that Julie and I have been going back and forth in the chat, and Anna's been weighing in. You know, I can't stress this enough. When you're looking to how the researchers need to interact with the program officials, the administrators, can you figure out how to align their learning agendas with the helping hands? How do you have the National Secure Data Service really have a function in that matchmaking that could occur? How do you help the people that the programs serve? That's kind of like what's going on the ground level. But you really don't want academics pestering Anna and Liz and Layla and Kim on this committee. You don't want a bunch of people saying, I have a really clever idea and knocking on their door to get data. So when you think of the NSDS as an intermediary acting there, that's really critical, and we have to think through what it could look like, but we don't want to harass the people that are the data controllers at the state and local level or even the federal level. So we have to try to assess how to answer some of these big questions about privacy, about the efforts to keep these systems and methods updated with the right balance in incentive building. So those are my comments, and I would love to open it up to my colleagues here, and I'm going to try to quickly look through the chat, but if anyone has questions, please pipe up while I do that.
Can I just respond briefly? Amy, those are great comments or great questions. One thing I forgot to mention was that part of that we think what we're learning here would be useful for other data sets as well. And we're trying to design it in such a way that it could be applied, you know, to other data sets. It could easily be adapted when we're looking at other years of data from the IRS. We're starting with 2012, which nobody's that interested in 2012, but we figure we could work out the bugs in that. There are later files that we can look at as well. And the trade-off between privacy and utility is talked about in kind of an abstract way in the literature. It really is fundamental. But I think the really big challenge is figuring out what the actual threat model is. It's not the one that's assumed in differential privacy where somebody has every record but one in a data set, almost infinite time and almost infinite computing power, and an interest in inferring every bit of information from the file. All of those things are not true. So I think there's a lot of good work on trying to relax the measure of privacy so that you can actually get very useful estimates while protecting against actually plausible threats. Barry mentioned in the chat that a big thing about tax data is it's not a voluntary survey. People are required by law to participate, and it's really important for the functioning of our democracy that they're willing to file tax returns. So we really do need to protect the data, but I think we can do that with this. Obviously, I think that because I've been working on it.
And this is Dom. I will mention that thankfully, this is a part of my closing remarks too. On the March session, we're going to be talking a lot more about privacy and confidentiality. So I think this is a great introduction to that. And so I'm checking one of the other things off and also give people a time check. They have one more short thing to go through. Thanks.
Anna, do you want to share the comment that you made in the chat and add to the discussion?
Sure, sorry, double muted.
So I would say in terms of, you know, the resourcing challenges, you know, certainly I think there's a lot of states that already are in a position where I think the majority of states, when we talk about wage record data in particular, we're challenged with the technology of really old technology. I mean, COBOL, you know, systems that we can hardly find the right technicians to keep running. I mean, one of the earlier examples of saying where you have a single point of failure, I think a lot of states are in that position. So any sort of change in terms of what we are asking the system to do and the data that's associated with those changes is very hard on a lot of states to get that accomplished. And, you know, frankly, with a lot of the federal law changes, of course, we are obligated to go ahead and, you know, try to make those changes to comply, but oftentimes it's without the resourcing and, frankly, the cover from the federal government, and in particular, you know, our legislators who pass these laws, and, you know, the public is in this, oh, well, they passed it, it's signed, and now we're going to get the benefit right out the door, or we're going to be able to have that new program implemented, right? So I think on the state and local level in particular, it's very hard for us to pivot on a dime like that. And when researchers come to us in particular, and they may pose a very interesting question, and maybe the value proposition is there, that, wow, this would be really interesting for us to know, but the interesting for us to know is not enough for us to then reprioritize our resourcing to get the answer to that question. It has to be like, what do I need to do to keep my program running? What do we need to do to make sure that the people that we're delivering services to are getting the services? And at the end of the day, are we able to consistently provide good quality data to support those measures that we have in place? Because, you know, again, a lot of, again, the previous presentations also talked about forms really driving the sort of data that state and local governments collect. And oftentimes those forms and those data sets do not align with what we on the management side really need to see as well. And so, you know, there's been a lot of workarounds over the time, but I think the two big things are, you know, resourcing, not just in terms of money, but also resourcing in terms of maybe that sort of matchmaking that you talked about, Amy, I think would be super helpful because, frankly, the skill sets that we need for data and data analysis within our agencies now are not the same sort of data set, you know, skill sets that we had before. For instance, like just fraud. You know, we aren't criminal investigators out there, but there are now a lot of different things that we don't necessarily understand what those data patterns could be to identify those things. And so, again, resourcing can be very challenging. So it's not just a matter of dollar and dime. It's also kind of rethinking how are we engaging with the data sets, and then what are the other resources that we can bring in. So researchers could definitely be very helpful in that. But our timeliness of meeting the results is, you know, almost like we needed it yesterday, right? So.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that if Ken were to go and try to do his project in the RDC network right now, I would suspect the quickest he might be able to get a project approved would be maybe in 9 months, and then he'd have to start working. Is that something that's going to meet the measurement needs for you or any of the other, like Liz or Layla or Kim, anybody else that's at that state, or David? Is that, what is the turnaround time that's going to work with your world?
I'll just say, I would suggest that it needs to be a shorter time frame and maybe a tighter research point, you know, because our bandwidth at the agencies, even in the next 9 months, are going to be really stretched. But certainly I would ask my other state and local government colleagues to chime in as well.
I have agreement in the chat from them that it's got to be sooner than later. But I think that, you know, for those of us that work in the logistics of how these processes flow together, I think it might be useful for the committee to really kind of dig into what sooner rather than later means. Does anybody else have a comment or a question for Ken and Len that spoke? Well, I'd like to give it like another minute and then we can turn it back over to Dawn.
my question always to Len is, with the validation server and the creation of the synthetic data, how long does it take? How much does it cost? And for most states, and the interest is obviously in serving particular subgroups. There's a big push right now on social justice. And how valuable is it for looking at subgroups, since that's a big portion of the value proposition?
So our goal is, you pointed out in an earlier meeting that
right.
We've invested a whole lot of resources into this, and it's taken a while. Part of the reason is we're trying to design a system that would be like a data sanitizer. You could take a data set, put it in, have it run for a while, and then you'd get a synthetic data set and a whole bunch of diagnostics that would let you know whether it was useful or not. I don't want to overpromise what we can do right now. Right now, the biggest value of the synthetic data might just be as a training data set for the validation server. But I do think it's feasible to set up automated systems that you could apply our data set or other data sets to that would preserve important characteristics of the data. And if you're looking at things like racial equity, you can design the synthesis process so that you make sure you keep those relationships. The trick is really using the synthetic data for purposes that it wasn't calibrated to match. Like, for example, a lot of economic research, as you know, looks at discontinuities, jumps at kink points in tax schedules or things like that. And unless you program the data set to capture those discontinuities, they'll just be smoothed out in the synthetic data. That's not really a problem if you can access the data through a validation server and get useful estimates. But this will be useful for some purposes. We'll have a pretty good idea of what it's useful for, and the validation server is really key for knowing what its limitations or what, when you can rely on the estimates and when you can't.
Great. Well, I want to thank you guys very much, and I want to hand it back over to Dom or Peter to get us to the end of our session today. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for the great presentations. Even with the synthetic data, harkening back to my older days when I wasn't a recovering economist and still actually thought about these things. So thanks everyone. So let me turn it right over to Peter. What he's going to do is going to walk us through, and I think we're just going to walk through the first draft synthesis of some of his work that he's been putting together. So I'll just maybe ask him to walk that through, and then I'll just have some relatively closing remarks and keep encouraging the conversation to go. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tom. So back in November and December, we had a conversation about identifying the North Star or the future state for the committee. And we had a Google Doc that was out there, and many of you, or most of you, provided input into the key questions around what does the future state look like, and how might we think about the end state outcomes, benefits, features of the committee's work as you look to the future. And I think the intent of doing that was to basically say, let's create a touchstone that we can come back to as we start to look at the requirements, we start to look at our recommendations from here, and take this future state and come back to it and say, okay, well, how congruent with the future state are we? And do we either need to change the direction we're heading in with the requirements and recommendations, or change what we have in the future state? So what I've created is a synthesis of the input and feedback that you all gave us back in November and December, and tried to bring together some of the common elements around where I think the general agreement is around the future state. What I did is there were really, even though there were a number of questions to define that future state, it really boiled down to what are the ends that we're after, what are the ultimate outcomes and benefits are we after, and what are the means to get there. So I broke down the synthesis into those two categories. What I'd like to do, because of the time we have, is get a sense you all participating in revising and reviewing and revising this, and maybe even getting a couple of volunteers to dig deeper into the future state document that we'll use as that touchstone going forward. So go ahead, next slide, Ryan. So I did create just a word cloud of all the input. Took your names out, and basically this is the preponderance of the key terms and key identifying pieces that people used in their input in their feedback. Word clouds are kind of fun to take a look at to see where the preponderance of some of the are. So, but let's move to those ends and means pieces. Go ahead, Ryan. Can you move to the next slide, Ryan? Yeah, there we go. So as I said, I looked at all of the data, all of the input and feedback that you provided on the future state, and I created some key terms that were used pretty commonly across the input that you provided. This is where you all ended up, at least based on my view of it, of where you saw the ends coming out. I'm not going to read every word here, but clearly policy making will be better informed through deeper meaning coming from linking heterogeneous data sets. Programmatic and policy decisions will be made with more complete evidence. Stakeholders across the spectrum will value that data is more accessible while protected. Political leaders and other decision makers will also see the value in the work. Experts and non-experts will be more skilled and adept at using the data. Innovation and collaboration will spur new ideas and methods and data use, sharing, protection, analysis, and public sector programs will see stronger results through improved and actionable performance and evaluation. So there's a lot here, but I think it really boils down to some of the key end states we're looking for in policy making and decision making, in stakeholder engagement and value propositions, in the skill set increases, the innovation and collaboration improvements, et cetera. Why don't we go to the means and then get some quick feedback. So the means are how we're going to get there. The secure and protected data, the privacy protections and anonymity or technology tools, the data sources shared by data owners, the linkages, the tools and methods available, the access provided based on credentials, tiering, et cetera. That requirements and reporting will be limited, reconciled, and scheduled. This came out of a lot of not just the state and local folks, but the rest as well. Training and professional development will be enhanced. And standardization and quality enhancement will continually evolve for data access, et cetera. So those are we have the ends and the means when we talk about the future state. And we're not going to have time to do a lot of debriefing on this right now. And so what I'd like to do is we'll put this out there on the BEA.gov site. I do have another Google Doc that summarizes this as well. We'll put that out there for comment and feedback. But let me go to the next steps, Ryan. So the last piece is that the NSDS will be established to guide and facilitate the development and execution of these ends and means. The committee will use the summary to serve as the touchstone to test future requirements and to revise it in light of those committee's ongoing deliberations. So we'll put this Google Doc out there for folks to further comment on and revise, particularly on those upfront pieces around ends and means. Are there specific committee members that have quick feedback on this? We could probably do it in 60 seconds, maybe, Tom.
Sorry, Peter. You also are fading in a little bit in and out, at least on my end. But I think we have a few minutes. I think primarily, look, I thought it was I thought that the top lines were very much consistent. You know, I noticed that, I don't know if you put in the bold on value and value proposition before or after this discussion. We certainly heard a little bit of that. Yeah, a little bit of that today. And I think we've heard a lot about how, you know, how do we make this flexible and worth everyone's while? Do we have a couple, like, I know there will be a lot of interest in this, and you probably, I would say, like, let's focus a couple minutes of conversation on whether we want to put together kind of a list, a coalition of the willing to dig a little deeper in addition to getting comments on the Google Doc itself. So any thoughts around those, that aspect of this?
Who would like to jump in and help?
Peter, I'd be willing to help.
Okay, Ted, great. Thanks, Ted.
Yep. I'm sure you're getting lots of volunteers. Not a shy group. There's several other help discussion. So.
Okay, great.
All right, great. So, and so thanks a lot, Peter. I think, yeah, you're getting a lot of help. I wanted to talk a little bit just for a couple more minutes because we didn't quite get to all the discussion that was happening on the side with the presentation. So I think it's good for public transparency. I was just going to give like a couple more minutes summary of that. I think that there is a lot of, I think that the researchers and the data professionals and maybe the data geeks are getting really excited about talking about how the validation servers may work and what other applications could also might benefit from one's good work. It's really the cutting edge and how we're going to get there. So that was just wanted to give the public know there's a lot of conversation that you'll see in the chat function about that and the opportunities and the challenges for all that. Okay, and then I think that we talked a little bit about Census's work and differential privacy, maybe some concerns about that as well. But again, just to preview what you'll see in the curated chat. And I think that, as I mentioned before, this is a this will be a subject. So I think that this was actually very much setting up a longer discussion about both privacy and confidentiality and technologies and related to secure data access, data ethics, things of that nature. That will be the subject of the next of the March meeting. Okay, and then we also I wanted to also give you a little bit of a preview of. Well, I'm sure that all these subjects will also come up in the other goal of the March meeting, which is to start to synthesize and discuss the public comments we have received. I think that looking at this document will be a great way in which to kind of think about how we're going to characterize and think through the public comments. And I'm confident because of the diversity and the expertise of this committee that while we will always learn a lot from public comments, I think there will be more in the nature of the emphasis on particular things that we probably have already considered. But I'm also hopeful that we'll just, what we usually do inevitably as someone who's actually a user and a studier of public comments, there's always a couple of things that we haven't thought of. So I think this is going to be a great opportunity. We want to take this very seriously and talk that through in great detail in the next meeting. Okay? We will, I think that what we're also working on for perhaps the next meeting, as I think the public and the committee knows, there is an embarrassment of riches with the new executive actions that the new administration has put in place, executive orders, presidential memoranda, and we are also trying to get ourselves organized and looking at the ways in which data and evidence, both the direct references and the indirect, and all those executive orders issued by the new administration. This will inevitably be an ongoing conversation as the new administration chooses its priorities based on this roadmap that's been given by the new executive actions that are still coming. So obviously that will be a living document. We'd like to discuss that a little bit more in the March meeting. Okay, just a little bit of in April, I think we'll hear from committee members on dealing with data from the physical sciences. I think it's going to be an incredibly interesting one. We've heard a lot about social science. the research here and learn about the physical sciences, will probably be a little bit of a different perspective. And we'll also be looking at, in more detail, the frameworks to guide our future work. And we are getting towards the end of the data collection phase and rapidly blowing, although this is a group that is already contemplating the next steps. And just a reminder, as we need to do a September report. Okay? And then let me do one more housekeeping exercise. I do apologize. I do have to adjourn a few minutes earlier due to a briefing that just came up. But let me look at the chat one more time before I call this meeting. We are at the point, I think, that the researchers have identified a lot of interesting aspects of how to interact with the federal government. And one thing that actually is coming up in the chat that also has we mentioned a little bit more detail is really the need for the skill sets. And so think about data science. I think that you saw that in the first presentation today. I think what we maybe in this group maybe didn't talk about as much as we should. Like, we've actually had a lot of interesting discussion within the government of what data the chief data officer actually means. I mean, there's an act, but we have a lot of other agency officials that have on other aspects of this. Just off the top of my head, the evaluation officers, the CIOs, the senior agency officials for privacy, and the statistical officials. So, a lot of this conversation that's been going to data is like, what is a CDO? What do they do? Where do they sit? What part of data is the emphasis? So I think we made progress on there, but probably wanted to not gloss over that's actually a very legitimate discussion in this area as well. I think that we're, again, we've heard a lot about we look at one more time, a lot about the data skills, and and sometimes this is, a matter of a very deliberate decision about whether the value proposition of a particular state or local government or federal is worth the cost that's going into this. Other times it's we can't find someone who can program the systems. And so I also think of this as potentially a conversation about making sure that whatever we want to do with the data, we have the skills and the ability to do it. And so with that, I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts to share, but we are just about at time. Okay, and so why don't I go ahead and adjourn the meeting. So thanks, everyone. This was a great presentation, set of presentations. Learned a lot myself about the synthetic data, the technical prowess that goes into that. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan.